Hi everybody, this is Brady Self again. I am with Mississippi State University Extension and I work as a forestry specialist in the Department of Forestry. What I want to make this video on is a topic that comes up a pretty fair amount in hardwood management with natural regeneration of hardwood species. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk primarily about the difference between shelterwoods and what a lot of people call select thins or diameter limit cuts, or just plain old high grade if you're not familiar with that. Basically different regeneration techniques that people use to try to get primarily oak back on the ground. With oak regeneration, when we're talking about especially bottomland hardwoods, but upland hardwoods too to a certain extent, oak species need somewhere in the neighborhood of a minimum of 25 to 30% available light. Now that's light that they use, the spectrum of light that they use to photosynthesize versus what we use in our visual spectrum. So it's a little different. They need at least 25% light. Typically, we're going to think 30% light to regenerate and to recruit. They can regenerate when they're 5–10% light, but they don't last very long. So to get them to actually recruit up into those into the canopy at some point, we have to increase that light level. So 25–30% on the low end. Optimal, from all the research that's been done over the last half century, is somewhere around 50% available light. So what we try to do with our thin ends and our shelterwood type cutting, and even in some cases some other things we do, is get that light level up to an appropriate point that our regeneration, once it's established, is able to recruit upward. It sounds pretty simple, but it's actually a somewhat involved process if we do it from a silvicultural standpoint. Nature will put stuff back on the ground. What we want to do is put a high number of oak species back on the ground when we're regenerating those stands. One of the first things that pops out when you're talking with people about oak regeneration is, I have my place select cut. Well, select cutting, again, you're talking something that's focused on pure economics. They take the best, they leave the rest with that type of cutting. Is going to be different than a shelterwood, where you're focusing on maintaining a certain spacing and a certain quantity of trees in the overstory to a point that you ensure a certain light level on the ground where you can get that regeneration. So as my major professor back in school used to say, you stop paying attention to what's up here and you start looking at the ground and trying to figure out how to get that regeneration going. So it's a little bit different than a thin. A thin is going to focus on maintaining quality species out there on the ground, quality stem quality of those species in an attempt to grow those trees bigger. With shelterwood cutting, what we're talking about, you can maintain some of that quality. You don't have to as much. You're trying to maintain enough quality in a species, from a species standpoint, that you're able to get that regeneration on the ground. So they're definitely different beasts, but they have the same appearance to a lot of people. So what I want to do is kind of point out some different things as we walk around and look about those two types of cuts. The first thing I want to do is I want to show you guys a couple of thins, if you want to call them that were done on a couple of properties we're going to look at here in a minute, where they're purely diameter limit cuts. That's what you're going to hear called that select cutting again. The goal there, that while it was marked and supposedly marketed as a thinning, that in reality that wasn't what it was. It was going to be something that was purely designed to maximize profit when they came through, yet while leaving some trees on the ground. So it's a totally different beast than when we get into the shelterwood world. One other thing that I want to point out before we get started is all these types of cuts, you have to be able to attract a logger. So if you can't get a logger in there, right, you're not going to be able to actually let the cutting pay for itself. You don't want this to be expensive, and you're dang sure not going to bring any money back in if it's truly something that you're just going in and you're taking 6 tons to the acre and you're just picking one tree out here and there. That's the reason why it's incredibly difficult to do uneven age management or single tree selection type management and uneven age management in bottomland hardwoods or in hardwoods in general across the South. It's incredibly difficult to go in and truly set those cuts up from a textbook definition style of uneven age management. We're going to focus on even age management, and again, I'm going to show you those Shelterwoods versus versus the traditional select cut that you see across a lot of South. Again, we're going to start off with those thinnings, those select cut areas. And I'm going to show you a couple of those, and we're going to move into looking at some of the Shelterwoods, and then I'll wrap it up and show you the difference, or I guess reiterate the differences between. But hopefully you'll see that from a regeneration standpoint, because that's what we're talking about, is trying to naturally regenerate these stands. Thanks. Stop number one. What we're looking at here is a high grade, also known as a diameter limit cut, that is bumping 2 years old now. They actually put this one in, this cutting in during July of 2018. So we're encroaching on our second year anniversary of this particular cut. Diameter limit cut, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, is basically where they set a diameter, a stump diameter, for the trees that they're going to remove in the cut. So anything, if they say a 15-inch stump, anything above 15 inches is going to be harvested. What that does, 15-inch stump diameter really doesn't amount to that much once you move up into the DB8 range, so 4.5 foot above ground. You really don't have that big of a tree. A 15-inch stump can give you an 11 or a 12 or a 13-inch diameter tree. Once you get into that level around your chest. So what happens is they take the best quality. Keep in mind, these are even age stands, so all the trees are relatively close in age. And what happens is they take the best trees out and they leave everything else. That's from a species standpoint and a stem quality standpoint. So what you'll see here is kind of an uneven distribution. If you look at, immediately in front of me, you see there's a big gap there. Okay, if you go to the extension website, Mississippi State University Extension website, and you look up a publication called Hardwoods, What is High Grading, you will see a photo that was taken right over there. And in that photo, you'll see the trees, larger diameter trees that are marked. And what they did is they marked those bigger trees and they took them out. What that does, it leaves you with this uneven distribution of trees. You'll have groupings of the trees that were bigger and higher quality, like you see in front of me here. Well, if you'll look there, you don't see the potential above it for acorns coming in, right? When you're thinking about things from a regeneration standpoint, there's not a lot of seed source in that particular spot out there. What they did leave are going to be lower quality. If you'll look over here, you've got a little scarlet oak. There's a couple more of those behind me. Here is a southern red oak that didn't have a lot of stem quality to it. If you'll see, you've got a lot of crook to that tree. Smaller diameter, mid-story type trees. There's a green ash that was of poor form. You start moving around, and even when you get into the areas where you start seeing a higher proportion of oak and a greater density, and they're kind of clumped, what you have are smaller diameter trees, or trees that are of an inferior species from a commercial forestry standpoint, or trees that are damaged, like the white oak right here. I walked over there a minute ago. Even though it's not that high quality, so you've got a lot of branches on the bole. Those are going to be degrades to the lumber that comes out of that tree. On the back side of that tree, there's a big cat face, a big canker sore, so a hollowed out defect on the back side of that tree. The other trees that you see out here are both lower diameter and of lower quality or lower desirability from a species standpoint. If you'll go back over here, you've got sweet gums down in the bottom. I see a sycamore, a couple of scarlet oaks, which are not going to have the value associated with that lumber that we would like to have. So smaller diameter green ash, smaller diameter southern red oak, and as you move up the hill, there is a cherry bark oak that they skipped over somehow. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that was. They missed one. I don't know what I can say. That's a good thing. That is a seed source that is going to provide some regeneration out here, but there's just not a lot of it. Now, I've walked through here. This is kind of not what I would call a jungle, but it's not far from it. Walking through here, I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen the first oak seedling, and at 2 years in, we would expect, so basically we had fall of 2018 and then last fall in 2019 that we should have seen acorns on the trees that are the residual trees that are out here. I haven't seen any regeneration on the ground from an oak standpoint. There's a little bit of other species, a lot of the arborescents, like the baccharis you see here, but not a lot of regen from an oak standpoint on this particular site. You get over, there's a little bit of elm and stuff like that. There's just not much coming back. This is not sustainable from an oak silviculture standpoint. Will something come back? Sure. But it comes down to what do you want back on your property post harvest. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the camera off and I'm going to load back up in the truck, and I'm going to go look at another site that's pretty similar to this, that was established as a high grade basically, but as a diameter limit cut, a select cut, whatever you want to call it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the process over there, and we'll look and walk around and see if we can find some regeneration under that particular stand. Here's our next diameter limit cut site. I actually came out here with the landowner and looked at this site prior to the harvesting that occurred. We talked about it, and I told him what I thought about the marking job, and they went ahead and went with the marking job that had already been done, and it was marked as a high grade. It was marked as that select cut that you keep hearing about. This stand had a fair amount of white oak in it prior to harvesting, and the landowner was trying to capitalize on the market for white oak. So you can't really blame the guy for wanting to make money off of his property. But now he's worried about the regeneration that's coming back, or the lack of regeneration that's coming back. If you'll look out here, you've got post oak. There is a white oak. There's one little white oak that did slip by. It's pretty low quality. You've got post oak. Down there I see one smaller diameter southern red. There's another one, sweet gum, post oak. If you look way down in the bottom, there's some southern reds that I haven't been down there to look to see what they look like exactly. Post oak, sweet gum, and so forth. So that there's not a lot of quality out here from a commercial standpoint. Where that becomes problematic, this side especially, if you'll look, there's a lot of shade on the ground out there. It's going to be really hard to get oak regeneration to establish out there and recruit without some help. We started talking about trying to do some injection work. They didn't do any on this particular site. That might get your light levels up, but I mean, if you look, you've still got a pretty solid canopy up there of undesirable species from a commercial standpoint. Again, undesirable species that are going to give you regeneration back of what? Undesirable species, because they pulled that more desirable species out of this particular site. It wasn't set up as a shelterwood. This one does have a lot more density than that first site we looked at, but it goes to the other extreme where, again, it wasn't designed for regeneration. It was designed for economics. It was designed to maximize money. And what you get is a situation where you have a low quality stand now that's going to be really tough to regenerate with higher quality species. I'm not saying you can't get a logger to come in and harvest this by any means. It's definitely possible. Post oak's used in tie logs and things like that. And then there's some other species, spread here and there in this stand. However, the bread, the value of this stand has been removed. So the stand becomes a lot lower in value. It's a lot harder to get somebody in here to take the species that are left, basically, is what it boils down to. Not saying there are not options here, but now we're locked into a situation where if you want to do some type of regeneration from an oak standpoint and have oak back on the ground, if you want those species to be of a desirable from a commercial standpoint, you're going to have to look at artificial regeneration. That's just the way the world works. You can't bring white oak and cherry bark oak and species like that are of higher desirability back from post oak and southern red oak and things like that. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, that's the way nature is. So this is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about a lower quality degraded stand cut. This just doesn't have the value associated with it from a lot of different aspects, and this is typically not what a landowner really wants to look at. There's still trees here, but it's typically not what a landowner wants to look at from a regeneration success story viewpoint, I guess. We're going to look at one more site, and then we will move over into looking at some shelterwood cuttings that we have some numbers for. This is the third select cut, diameter limit cut, high grade that we're going to look at today. This is going to be the last site. This one's a little different than the other two. I'm trying to give you guys sort of a range of what goes on out here. This particular site, unlike the other two, which had at least some thought put into what was going to be harvested, this particular site, the landowner just talked to a local logger and said, hey, I want you to come out and I want you to make me the most money that you can make me on my property. So they actually came out and performed a flat out, high grade. This site had a fair amount of white oak in it, has some post oak here and there, and some other, less desirable commercial species growing on it. What I want to point out is, and we're kind of right on the verge of the upland and the bottomland right here. So, we're looking at the upland right now, and I'm going to show you where we kind of drop off into some of those bottomland species behind me. If you'll look in the uplands, there's a lot of tops, a lot of stuff that's been cut out, and all that's left is, primarily sweet gum. There's a little bit of other stuff out there. I see mainly gum, a few hickories, and it looks like a couple of white oaks way up the hill that are forked. As you cycle on around, obviously there's a cedar, it's going to be a little bit drier. Post oak, nothing of any value. There's a southern red that's a little higher in value. And then we drop off into more of the uplands, the bottomland species. Now this particular site was at one point, my guess, at one point we're looking at something that was probably an ag field if you go far enough back. Looking at the, some other things that I've seen as I walk across the site. Down here, we're looking at, there's a little bit of sweet gum, there's a little bit of cherry bark, but they're all small diameter. Well, once you move on around and through this site, what you'll find is, you can see where the skidder went through, they went in and they pulled, they just picked at this stand and took out the highest quality trees. Now right there, you see a couple of larger diameter trees. That is a cherry bark oak, and the reason they left those is it's going to be kind of hard to cut those to begin with, the way they fork. They're also really on the large end for what they were trying to take out of here. So you can have trees that are too big. Most of us know that. Trees that are actually too big to be merchantable. In this particular case, those also have some issues when you get up close with knots and things like that on the backside, as well as some that you can see on the front. You cycle on around, you're still in the smaller diameter, sweet gum, and then you're kind of back into the, transitioning back into the more upland species complexes once we move up there. What I want to point out is in both cases, the regeneration potential of this site's not completely shot. There are some species out there that are desirable, but how are you going to get them on the ground? Right through here, where you can see where the skidder ran, and the cutter ran, you can see that, there's a little bit of light, but even now, and I didn't mention it, this particular site was harvested last year. This particular site doesn't have a lot of regeneration potential, even in the situation of an open area like we're kind of looking at there and back behind us. First off, there's no seed source, right? In addition to that, there's not enough space, enough gap, so to speak, created by the openings in the canopy to enable, long-term light on the ground, which would promote those species that we're trying to regenerate. If you look into the area there where they just drove through and picked out of those upland species, as well as down here, in the more bottomland species, there's not a lot of light that gets to the ground. When you start talking about regeneration and needing to get those light levels up into that 30, 40, 50, 60% available light, that's not going to happen in these situations. And what happens is, as those older oaks drop out, you start picking up those more shade tolerant species that are able to establish underneath, like the elm that you're looking at right here. So there's a lot that can be more that can be said. And when I wrap this up, I do want to point out a couple of things about Shelterwood, but neither of these three, none of the three of these earlier stands that we've looked at are really going to be suitable if you are looking at trying to regenerate a stand. That's the difference between this type of cutting and Shelterwood cutting. Again, all we're focusing on here is economics. We're just trying to get the wood out. We're not necessarily even going to consider long-term impact to the stand from a growth potential standpoint, versus the Shelterwood approach, which is going to be, what do I do to enable this stand to properly regenerate and give me a stand that I can manage in the future? So we're going to look at three establish Shelterwoods and talk about some of the differences in those stands. And then, like I said, I'll wrap it up at the end with a little bit of explanation about some more of the, I guess, paper differences between the two treatment types.